Hello, everyone, and welcome to the closing keynote of the International Association of Constitutional Law's Junior Scholars Forum. Before I begin, I'd just like to let you know that if you'd like a French translation of today's event, you can access the translation through the interpretation button, which is down on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So as is customary in Australia, at the start of a public event, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional Indigenous owners of the lands on which I meet today, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respect to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Indigenous persons joining us tonight. So as this keynote marks the close of this Junior Scholars Forum, before I introduce our speaker, I'd just like to give a few votes of thanks for people who have helped make the last 5 days possible. So first, I'd like to thank the early career scholars who've joined us over these 5 days and shared their work with us. It's been a real delight and privilege to read your work and get to know you over Zoom. And it's really reassuring to know that the future of the discipline is in safe hands. Thanks also to our distinguished scholars that generously lent us their time and expertise to comment on the papers and provide such helpful and constructive feedback to the junior scholars. And then finally, thanks to the people behind the scenes that have made everything run so smoothly. In particular, our great thanks to Fina Wong and Saguna Jagannathan from the National University of Singapore for their work on helping establish and compile the program and for arranging all of the online facilities. And thanks also to Gabby Delasso from Melbourne Law School for her work organising the translators. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Adrienne Stone. She is the president of the International Association of Constitutional Law, the Kathleen Fitzpatrick Australian Laureate Fellow, Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor, and Director of the Centre of Comparative Constitutional Studies at the University of Melbourne. Adrienne is an expert on many areas of constitutional law and theory, in particular freedom of expression and, appropriately for tonight, academic freedom. Indeed, her latest book, co-authored with Carolyn Evans, is on this subject, titled Open Minds, Academic Freedom and Freedom of Speech. So thanks so much to you, Adrienne, for agreeing to share your thoughts on the relationship between universities and democracy with us.
Thanks so much, Scott, for that generous introduction. And let me lend also my voice to the thanks you've offered. And I'll have something more to say by way of thanks at the end. Can I just begin by saying it really is such an honour and a pleasure to speak to you today. I have so enjoyed watching this event come to life in such a convincing fashion over the last few days. It began as just the seed of an idea that I discussed with Jacqueline and Scott some years ago, and I've just been delighted to see it flower in such a terrific way. So let me turn to the topic that I wanted to talk to you about tonight, academic freedom and democracy. So for the last few days, we have gathered as scholars to listen, to engage in collaborative exercise. We've listened to each other, we've challenged each other, we've criticised each other, and we've assisted each other. And through this process of dialogue and debate and exchange, we've all learned something. So we will, I'm sure, all leave this forum understanding something we did not understand and knowing something that we did not previously know. In short, we have been engaged in academic inquiry. And the topic of my talk today is the value of academic inquiry and about the academic freedom need to protect it and the connections between that freedom and democracy. My essential point is academic freedom brings enormous public goods to society in the form of the advancement of knowledge and in support of democracy. In turn, however, this means that academic freedom and that universities themselves require a commitment to democracy in a rather full sense. Universities thrive in societies that are truly committed to free academic inquiry, And this means they need societies that are prepared to wear the discomfort that challenging, independent thinkers can bring. For this reason, academic freedom should be understood as having a constitutional dimension. And as scholars, I suggest that we are committed not only to our disciplines, but to democracy in a full sense. Let me start by thinking a little more about the case for academic freedom. Now, I'm aware that for an audience such as this, perhaps academic freedom needs no justification. After all, it's a freedom for each of us as scholars to do the thing we really like to do, to pursue our chosen profession. But it is much, much more than this, and it's worthy, I think, of sustained reflection. And to make a case for academic freedom, we need to return to an even more foundational idea, the idea of the university itself. So the very etymology of university, derived from post-classical Latin for a society or a corporate body, points to the idea that it is a community of scholars and teachers engaged in joint intellectual endeavour. But beyond this, there are multiple and sometimes competing conceptions of the point of this kind of community. Some thinkers about universities have valued the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. John Henry Newman's 19th century classic, The Idea of a University, stresses that knowledge is to be valued as its own end. Such thinkers often point to the risks inherent in an instrumental conception of universities, rendering them subject to some kind of commodification. The Australian philosopher Raymond Gaita expressed this sentiment clearly in his essay To Civilise the City. If, for example, he says you describe what students and their teachers achieve in a university as a product, then the thought goes, good managers from the private sector should be able to take up management posts in universities, whether they have a rich understanding of the life of the mind or virtually no understanding at all. In other words, universities become mere corporate entities producing a product and ought to be governed as such. I have some sympathy for this worry about arguing for universities only in terms of the intrinsic worth of study. But I do think that kind of an argument risks in the end underestimating the worth of universities. Universities do produce clear and tangible benefits to the whole of society, and continued support for universities, especially in publicly funded university systems, is dependent upon a strong public understanding of that fact. In my view, the best response to the worry about the commodification of university research lies in the understanding of the breadth of the benefits they provide. And the benefits of research in the STEM disciplines, science, engineering, technology, mathematics, medicine, might be the most obvious and tangible. Research in these fields helps us live a longer life, creates material goods for humans to enjoy, helps us protect and control our environment. But the social sciences, including law, are often highly practical as well, helping us to understand and improve our government, society, economy, social structures, and many other aspects of our lives. But even disciplines that yield no practical and material benefits of this kind are enormously important in fundamental ways. Some disciplines, the humanities especially, and I would include in this aspects of legal scholarship, can help us understand the human consequences of scientific progress and interrogate fundamental ideas like justice, equality, and morality. In short, while some disciplines help us achieve a good society, others help us understand what a good society is. The case for academic freedom is, in my view, grounded in this understanding of universities. Stated simply, academic freedom is a claim that academics personally, and some others engaged in academic inquiry, are entitled to certain kinds of freedoms and privileges. These freedoms and privileges are not enjoyed by others, including other employees of the university, nor accorded to other professional enterprises. As commonly understood, the core activities to which academic freedom applies are research, publication, and teaching. Now, in describing academic freedom in this way, I have deliberately avoided the language of rights, which tends to suggest that academic freedom serves the interests of the individual. It also tends to raise a series of distracting questions about who holds rights to academic freedom, whether it is a right of academics, what about students or university librarians or lab technicians or non-academic staff, What about those who hold honorary appointments? And sundry other questions. It also risks confusion with freedom of speech, which I do think is properly described as a right and which I take to be a quite distinct principle. So conceiving of academic freedom in the way I do directs attention instead to its purpose, ensuring that universities can fulfill their core function of advancing knowledge, and in turn to the activity of teaching and research itself. So let me turn then from this idea of the university to what I take to be the primary argument for academic freedom, and that is that free inquiry promotes the search for knowledge. It turns on the basic proposition that free academic inquiry is conducive to the production and dissemination of knowledge. Academic progress is most likely where academic inquiry is driven only by the inquiring mind and unconstrained by university governments, university bureaucracies, and other external pressures. It relies on the proposition that knowledge is advanced through systematic inquiry and the testing of old ideas and new. In this respect, the case for academic freedom resembles one of the oldest and best known arguments for freedom of speech, the Millian argument that freedom of speech promotes the search for truth. Now, this argument, put by John Stuart Mill, depends upon the idea that humans are fallible and therefore the best way to be assured of truth is to allow all ideas to be subject to contradiction and to the possibility of being disproved. Over time, through constant exposure to contradiction, orthodoxies are revised, bringing ever more assurance, though never complete assurance, of our understandings. Now, using Mill's idea in this way might seem pretty risky. His idea that truth emerged from a process of contradiction and re-evaluation has been much criticised as insensitive to the harms caused by speech and over-optimistic, if not wildly naive, about the capacity for an unregulated public discourse actually to produce something that we could call the truth. To expand upon this last point, the idea of a, quote, marketplace of ideas suffers from at least two kinds of faults. The first lies in the inequality among speakers in their access to the means of communication, which greatly favours the voices of some over others. But even putting that to one side, there's simply no reason to think that truth will necessarily emerge in the face of deliberate lying, manipulation, and self-interested deception. And this long-standing critique is, as many of you will instantly realise, much amplified in the digital economy, where overwhelming amounts of information are easily available to citizens at all times. The attention of the public is increasingly scarce, and the public's capacity to determine the truth of information is degraded by the anonymity of communication and the breakdown of trusted gateways like the legacy media. But these are very strong arguments when this justification is wielded in support of free speech generally. But they give way when the argument is deployed in support of academic freedom. In other words, J.S. Mill may not have developed a totally convincing argument for freedom of speech, but a much better argument for academic freedom. And to explain why, I need for a moment to consider the nature of academic inquiry. The key to understanding academic freedom is that academic inquiry pursues knowledge in distinctive ways. Universities pursue their mission through academic disciplines, which are characterised by standards and methods that are designed to ensure expertise and independence in research. Mastering these methods is an important part of the research training that all of us as academics undertake. In other words, academics develop expertise. The scientific method is perhaps the best known and widely understood of these methods that give rise to expertise, but all disciplines have methods specific to them through which they subject claims to contradiction and challenge. And among other things, the methods of these disciplines insist upon evidence and justification and expose ideas systematically to tests capable of invalidating them. They also require independent judgment. Therefore, academic methods and disciplinary standards can and should be contested, of course, but academic freedom requires that a discipline is ultimately self-governing. What constitutes good science, good philosophy, or good history is not a matter for university administrators or politicians to decide. It is a matter for scientists, philosophers and historians. Now, these constraints imposed by the disciplines have two consequences for academic freedom. First, while universities cannot claim to monopolise the advancement of knowledge, the development and adoptions of methods and disciplines makes university research unique. They give academic expertise independent. So, for example, while journalists are committed, of course, to independence and to the search for truth, they may not have the research expertise or the broad research mission of universities. Think tanks, commercial research organisations may, on the other hand, advance knowledge across a broad range of research areas, and they may house researchers and frequently do with special expertise, but they may not and do not have the independence of the university academic. So this combination of independence and expertise is critical to the functioning of the university. Now, the deployment of disciplinary method also provides something of an answer to the skeptics of the Millian argument. When academic research is considered in the light of the disciplining effects of its methods, it should be evidence that the arguments marshalled against Mill, his insensitivity to harm and over-optimism about the capacity actually to advance knowledge, are much less strong when directed against free academic inquiry. Most of the kinds of speech that cause harm, libel, threats, obscenity, pornography, ordinary racial vilification, cannot be justified as part of the academic enterprise. Moreover, academic discourse simply does not resemble the unruly and overloaded modern marketplace of ideas. Indeed, the constraints of the disciplines, the commitment to academic methods, are designed precisely to address these kinds of problems that bedevil public discourse. These features do not, of course, allow academics to claim infallibility. On the contrary, the argument I've made would insist that all claims are always subject to potential invalidation, but they do serve as something of a pathology, of an antidote to the pathologies that otherwise attend this form of argument. Now, that is the core of the case for academic freedom as I see it. But I do also want to make the point that is especially important for my remarks tonight, that universities play an extremely important role in supporting democratic government. Now, this argument is sometimes put in two ways. The first, which is perhaps the more common, relies on the power of a university education. So it's said that a university education is what creates an active and engaged citizenry. Now, there is some sense to this idea. A university education should equip its students with knowledge about the world and with the intellectual skills that enable to be active and effective citizens. But the claim could only at best be partial support for academic freedom. After all, not all citizens attend university, and it cannot reasonably be claimed that a university education is either necessary or sufficient for good citizenship. My view is that universities support democracy much more powerfully through the provision of expertise and information to the citizenry as a whole. A critical part of democratic government relies upon the participation of an informed citizenry in public discourse, and then ultimately in electing governments in most forms of democracy and holding to account. The complexity of modern governance is such that at any point, myriad public issues, whether it's the causes and effects of climate change, the effect of tax policy on the economy, the morality of assisted dying, the desirability of banning mobile phones in schools, can only be understood in light of reliable and independent research of the kind that only universities produce. The pathology of the modern speech economy discussed earlier make this aspect of a university's role all the more important. Indeed, in circumstances of political polarization, where imposing political forces increasingly present competing versions of the facts, reliant on independent disciplined university research may be one of the few ways to progress political arguments. And some of the attacks on academic expertise in research must be understood as a political tactic by those who have no desire for these debates to progress. So in this respect, the argument for academic freedom resembles another common argument for freedom of speech. That is that freedom of speech ensures that citizens are able to engage in democratic self-government. But once again, the argument is adjusted. Deployed in support of academic freedom, the argument from democracy is narrower, focusing on the importance for democracy of systematic, discipline-based research and teaching. Many institutions contribute to democracy in many ways, but only universities can undertake discipline-based research and teaching with the requisite degree of expertise, breadth, reliability, and independence, and that this justifies the protection of academic freedom. Let me turn then now to consider the other side of the coin. I have made this argument about the support that universities provide for democracy in some detail, in part because I think it's just important to reflect upon it as academics, but also because it reveals some of the vulnerabilities of universities and of academics. Universities are, by design, institutions that are likely to prove challenging for authorities. Their raison d'etre is to challenge the intellectual status quo, and in doing so, may challenge the political and social status quo. They enable the citizenry to exercise democratic choice and to hold governments to account by rendering them, as Robert Post would say, democratically competent. It should be no surprise, therefore, that academics individually and universities collectively are under a threat concomitantly with the contemporary rise in threats to democracy. There are some very obvious places where academic freedom is under threat. One can hardly look past the very sorry story of the Central European University being in effect driven out of Hungary, but we also see it in attacks on prominent academics, including those in our own field. In India, in the troubling case of Pratap Mehta, in Brazil, where our comparative constitutional law colleague Conrado Hubner Mendes is under attack, and in Poland, where our colleague Wojciech Sadurski has been subject to ideologically motivated prosecution. Now, these are extreme examples, but there are threats to academic freedom, even where the threats to democracy are weaker. And they can be seen well, even in places like my own country, which are, for the moment at least, relatively healthy democracies. The rise of the populist right is a natural enemy for universities, or perhaps I should say, is naturally inclined to regard university as its enemy. Following Rogers Brubaker, if you understand populism as an ideology that identifies one true people and excludes elites from that conception of the people, then universities become naturally understood as the other. So elements of right-wing parties, even in quite healthy democracies, therefore paint universities as the home of degenerate elites that are disloyal to the society. They also seek, therefore, to undermine belief in expertise. Now, I think this kind of threat associated with the rise of the populist right is also combined with threats of a traditionally neoliberal type that we see especially strongly in Australia, for example, which involves treating universities like other corporate bodies and governing them as such without reference to academic values. Indeed, as I speak to academics around the world, almost all of them recognize some form of the attack on universities in their own societies, ranging from the cultural attacks of the populist right to excessive government regulation and excessive managerialism in universities. So the point of insisting on understanding the connection between universities and democracy is to see that both things are true. Democracies need universities, and by virtue of that fact, universities need democracy. And in insisting on this, I hope to draw out and convince you that academic freedom has a constitutional dimension. In understanding this, we can see what's really at stake in these debates. First, we should be clear that a claim to academic freedom is not a special pleading of a privilege with no justification. It is a principle that protects the public good in the advancement of knowledge and in a healthy functioning democracy. Second, in understanding that universities are constitutional actors, we should also understand that scholars are constitutional actors. In saying this, I do not draw a sharp distinction between scholars who are activists in support of democracy and others. I've no wish to cast aspersions on academics who work in an overtly activist mode. On the contrary, I believe there is an important place in the academy for such work, provided that it respects core academic values. But I do think that all of us, all the time, if we are engaged in good faith and open-minded pursuit of knowledge, are all engaged in the provision of the essential infrastructure for democracy. Concomitantly with this, I do not wish to place special emphasis on our status as constitutional scholars. I'm a great admirer of a recent paper by Leora Lazarus that describes constitutional scholars as constitutional actors. But unlike Professor Lazarus, I do not see the work of a constitutional scholar as of special importance over and above other scholars for the maintenance of democracy. Of course, our subject is very often democracy itself. And there will be times when threats to democracy come from attacks upon institutions, structures, and norms of which we have special knowledge. And in those circumstances, no doubt we have a special role to play. But we're not the only scholars who study democracy. Indeed, the range of disciplines that study democracy is astonishingly broad, extending very far from constitutional law and political science into seemingly far-flung disciplines like cognitive psychology and information technology. But more fundamentally, there are times when democracies have other needs. There are times when what they need to survive is not knowledge about and advocacy for their constitutional foundation or institutional arrangements, but reliable, independent knowledge of the kind universities produce that allow citizens to hold governments to account. That might be, depending on the particular moment in time and the subject at issue, a sound moral discourse of the kind that philosophers are expert in producing, or it might be expert information about complex matters on which policy depends. It's hard to overlook the important role that university-based epidemiologists have played in providing citizens with information necessary to hold our governments to account during this COVID crisis. So let me conclude. Universities are essential institutions for democracy, and as scholars, we all have an interest in, and really, I think, a moral obligation to the rest of society to promote a strong understanding of those connections. As scholars, we may have few substantive commitments by virtue of our role as scholars, but I do think we are committed to democracy, and that commitment follows from our very commitment to scholarship itself. Thank you, Scott. I'm done.
Thanks so much, Adrienne, for that really, really rich set of remarks. Now, I'm mindful of the time, but Adrienne has very generously agreed to answer a few questions. So maybe I'll just pose two to you, Adrienne, drawn from the Q&A in the chat. The first one is whether you think your thesis about academic freedom has anything to lend to debates about universities and cancel culture and them as platforms for diverse sets of speakers, and whether as a result of academic freedom, there's also an obligation on universities to sort of allow other people in from all ranges of the sort of political spectrum to speak to academics and students and to society more generally.
That's a really big question. I'm really glad you asked it. I'll do my best at answering it. In short, I would like to say that those questions are really important, but they're not really academic freedom questions. There are questions about freedom of speech in the public sphere of the university. So in short, and I do develop this at more length in other work, I take academic freedom to be the principle that protects the research and teaching mission of a university. That's not all that happens in a university. Universities have a public square, and they're sometimes a forum for ordinary politics. At that point, I think we have to think about freedom of speech principles. Now, what do we do when we might think those values conflict? Now, most of the time, I think they operate to support each other. You know, a robust open public square of a university supports the kind of intellectual environment in which academic freedom also thrives. But very occasionally, I do think that there are instances in which what happens in ordinary politics can actually seem to be seen to be antithetical to what happens in the university. So it might, for example, undermine or operate in flagrant disregard of academic standards and the idea of academic research, or it might seek to truly demonize some aspect of or some part of the university community in a way that in turn makes teaching and research very difficult. Now, in those circumstances, I do think it's academic freedom that ought to prevail, and universities might want to act to curate the public square in ways that might involve sometimes not welcoming every single idea and every single speaker. So the short point is this: universities are not simply a forum for the exercise of politics in the world at large. Sometimes you want to say to people, you can go and protest on the streets, take that to the steps of Parliament House, but don't bring it onto our community where we're trying to actually advance knowledge. That's rare, but occasional.
And a second question, very appropriate for you as the president of the IACL, asks whether there is a role for the IACL to act towards strengthening academic freedom beyond what it was already doing.
I suspect that's true, and I thank my good colleague Eva Brems for the excellent provocation. I think so part of what I want to say is I think we do in the IACL support academic freedom. Academic freedom standards are really integral to the way that we organise our events, and we do insist on the maintenance of academic freedom standards. And we do, on occasion also, we have spoke out in support of academics who are under attack. The next thing I would say is one of the best things we can do to support academic freedom is to support democracy and open society itself. And that's absolutely the core of our mission. Now, whether there's something else we should be doing is something on which I would welcome further initiatives and suggestions. I'm sure there's lots.
Okay, I've just been told by the powers that be that I can go 5 more minutes before we all get kicked out. So let me just ask one more question here. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, sorry. But one other question asks, how do you draw a limit to the scope of academic freedom, especially if scholars are presenting distorted interpretations of history and knowledge? How should we react to such activities of scholars who are doing this and insisting on their academic freedom?
Okay, so I think that there will be some limits where scholars are engaging using academic freedom as a cover for something that is blatantly not an academic enterprise. I think that we ought to be prepared to call that out and not extend the protection of academic freedom. So, for example, the kind of scholarly veneer that is placed over Holocaust denial should be recognised for what it is. But beyond really the extremes, I do think that heterodoxy is something that the disciplines themselves need to sort out. So I'm following recently a case that's just been in the High Court of Australia concerning controversial statements by a climate-denying university scientist. Now, I'm not a climate scientist, so I don't really know the truth of it, but my inclination is to accept the scientific consensus about climate, and that would lead me to reject this academic's views. But I do think that that's something that ought to be dealt with through invalidation by other scientists, by and large. So as much as possible, we shouldn't intervene. Okay, so can I attempt at this? There is a very long question here about Mill and universities that I'll sort of try to summarize, is that would be interested in to understand Mill's argument, particularly in relation to universities, and we're interested to hear your views on the many objections to mills that apply to universities, but perhaps less than to public discourse in general. I'm not quite sure if I've accurately summarized it. I hope that's okay. I'm just looking at this question, which comes from James Folks. Lovely to see you here, James. So I think so let me just say, I'm not quite sure I have got the perfect answer to this question. I think I understand it. So I want to say that most of the really well-known objections to Mill are at least somewhat mitigated in the academic sphere because the pathologies of the market-based of ideas are very much less evident in universities. Now, I think perhaps what you are pushing me to say is this: if you take that view, and I do expand on this a little bit with a little bit more subtlety in the book, you are committed to having a university community that is truly open-minded, and that sort of my defense of academic freedom is really undermined if we have excessive academic hierarchy, non-inclusive universities that systematically exclude people, and if we have even just sort of instances of groupthink. So one of the things I think a commitment to academic freedom entails is kind of an ethical commitment to very high levels of equality and genuine open-mindedness in the academic community. Now, and I think we are much more likely to achieve that in a university than we are in the society at large. But I take your point, James. There is a version of the argument that I need to deal with a little bit more.
Okay, so all that remains, therefore, is to thank you, Adrienne, not only for your remarks tonight, but also for your incredible vision and energy in bringing the Junior Scholars Forum to fruition. You've been pushing Jacqueline and I for many years to help bring it all together, and we couldn't have done it without you. And I think hopefully everyone who's attended or participated will think that will agree that it's been an amazing initiative of yours as the president of the IACL. So thank you both for this and for the larger event.
So I'm going to insist that I just have 1 minute to say that when we talk about energy and vision, I cannot compliment enough Scott and Jacqueline for the way in which they have just stayed focused on this event. They're generous to thank me, but the large measure of the thanks goes to them. They really wanted to do this. They showed exceptional leadership in the way they conceived of and actuated this event. And the International Association of Constitutional Law is in your debt. And I know all the participants are here in your debt. And let me just close by saying that you've set a very high standard for the future. And I very much hope to see this event continue. And I hope that we'll be able to live up to what you and Jacqueline have achieved. So my most profound and warm thanks to everybody else that's here. It's been wonderful to get to know you over the last few days. I look forward to seeing you soon, if not before, at our next World Congress in Johannesburg.
Exactly. Thank you very much, everyone.